Today, humans live almost everywhere on Earth, from the frozen landscapes near the Arctic to scorching deserts, dense forests, remote islands, and towering mountains. Our species has adapted to environments that once seemed impossible to survive. But this was not always our story. There was a time when all humans lived in a much smaller part of the world. For countless generations, Africa was the only home our ancestors had ever known. Then something extraordinary happened. A small population of early humans began, moving beyond the familiar landscapes of their homeland, taking their first steps into a world they had never seen before. Behind them was everything they knew. Ahead lay unfamiliar lands, changing climates, dangerous animals, and challenges no human in their group had ever faced. They had no maps to guide them, no cities waiting in the distance, no certainty that they would find food, water, or even survive the journey. For the people taking those first steps, every decision mattered. Every river could become a barrier. Every unfamiliar landscape could hide new dangers. Every mistake could carry a terrible cost. And perhaps the most remarkable part of their story is this. They were not the fastest animals. They were not the strongest. They had no claws, no fangs, and no natural armor. So how did they succeed where so many other species could not? Their greatest survival tool was not something they carried in their hands. It was something they carried inside their minds, the remarkable ability to learn, adapt, cooperate, and pass knowledge from one generation to the next. That ability would help small groups of humans spread across continents and eventually shape the world we know today. But what drove them to leave Africa in the first place? What dangers waited beyond the horizon? And how did a vulnerable species survive one of the most remarkable journeys in human history? This is the story of the journey that changed humanity forever. Act 2. Africa, the testing ground of humanity. Before humans crossed oceans, deserts, and continents, they first had to survive the place where their story began. Africa was not just a land they lived in. It was the home where humanity learned how to survive. For thousands of generations, early humans adapted to a constantly changing world. Grasslands expanded and disappeared, climates shifted, and finding food and water required awareness, cooperation, and flexibility. But survival was never guaranteed. Compared with many animals around them, humans were physically vulnerable. They did not have the speed of predators, the strength of large animals, or natural weapons to protect themselves. Yet they possessed something different. Their greatest survival advantage was not something they carried in their hands. It was something that allowed them to change the way they lived. They learned from experience. They created tools, worked together, and passed knowledge from one generation to the next. A single human facing nature alone was vulnerable, but a group working together could overcome challenges that no individual could survive. For thousands of years, these abilities helped humans thrive in Africa, but the world around them was never still. And eventually, adaptation created a new possibility. If humans could survive one environment, could they survive another? Beyond the familiar horizon, new lands were waiting, along with new dangers. And one question remained. What could have pushed humans to leave the only home their species had ever known? Act 3. The mystery of why humans left Africa. For thousands of generations, Africa had been humanity's home. It was the place where humans learned to survive, adapt, and overcome challenges. So why would anyone leave behind the only world their species had ever known? The truth is, there was probably no single reason. Researchers believe that several factors may have influenced human movement beyond Africa. The environment around them was constantly changing. Climates shifted, landscapes transformed, and the availability of food and water was never guaranteed. For early humans, adaptation was not a choice. It was a necessity. But change also created opportunity. New landscapes meant new resources. New environments offered new possibilities. And the same curiosity that helped humans understand their surroundings may have encouraged them to explore beyond familiar lands. Yet exploration came with enormous risks. Leaving Africa meant entering places where humans had no experience surviving. There were no maps showing the safest paths. No knowledge of what waited beyond the horizon. Only uncertainty. But something inside humans pushed them forward. The ability to imagine possibilities beyond what they already knew. And eventually, some groups made the decision that would transform the future of our species. They began moving into the unknown. But leaving Africa was only the beginning. The real challenge was surviving the world beyond it. Act 4. Into the unknown world. The journey out of Africa was not the end of the struggle. It was the moment the struggle truly began. Step by step, small groups of humans crossed beyond the boundaries of everything they knew. Behind them were familiar landscapes, familiar resources, and generations of knowledge about their surroundings. Ahead was uncertainty. They entered environments that were completely different from the ones their ancestors had adapted to for thousands of years. Some areas were dry and difficult to cross. Others were cold, unfamiliar, and demanding. Every new landscape brought new questions. Where could they find food? Where could they find shelter? How would they survive conditions they had never experienced before? They were not entering an empty world. They encountered new animals, new ecosystems, and challenges that tested their ability to adapt. For these early travelers, survival depended on learning quickly. A mistake could mean hunger. A failed decision could mean danger for the entire group. Yet they continued forward. Not because the journey was easy, but because humans had something that allowed them to face the unknown. They could observe. They could experiment. They could share knowledge, and with every challenge they overcame, they became better prepared for the next one. The world beyond Africa was not waiting for humans to succeed. They had to earn their place in it. But the question remained, how could a vulnerable species survive in environments that had never been home before? Act 5. The survival advantage that changed everything. The world beyond Africa was not designed for humans to survive easily. They faced unfamiliar environments, unpredictable conditions, and challenges that demanded more than physical strength. But humans had an advantage that changed everything. Their greatest survival tool was not their bodies. It was their ability to solve problems. When they entered new environments, they did not simply endure the challenges around them. They found ways to adapt. They created tools that helped them hunt, prepare food, and protect themselves. They learned to use fire, not only for warmth, but also for cooking, safety, and surviving colder conditions. They created clothing and shelters that allowed them to live in places their ancestors had never experienced before. But perhaps their greatest advantage was cooperation. A single human facing the dangers of the unknown was vulnerable. A group working together could share knowledge, protect one another, and overcome challenges that no individual could face alone. Every successful discovery became a lesson passed to the next generation. A better tool, a safer shelter, a new way to survive. Human progress was built through thousands of small adaptations. They did not survive because they were the strongest creatures on Earth. They survived because they could learn faster than the challenges around them changed. And with every new environment they entered, humans carried the same powerful ability, the ability to adapt. But survival was only the beginning. As humans continued moving across the planet, their journey would transform not only where they lived, but the entire future of our species. Act 6. Humans reach the world. The survival skills that helped humans move beyond Africa became the same skills that carried them across the planet. Generation after generation, small groups continued their journey into new environments. They entered landscapes unlike anything their ancestors had known. Some faced colder regions where survival required new strategies. Others adapted to forests, grasslands, coastlines, and unfamiliar ecosystems. Every new place brought new challenges. But humans carried something more powerful than any single tool. They carried knowledge. They learned from each environment they entered. They changed their methods, improved their technology, and passed their discoveries to those who came after them. Slowly, the footsteps of early humans reached farther, across parts of Asia, into Europe, across island worlds, and eventually to Australia. Much later, humans reached the Americas, completing one of the most remarkable patterns of movement in our species' history. But this was not a story of humans simply spreading across the planet. It was a story of adaptation. Each environment shaped the people who lived there, and each generation added something new to the human story, a journey that began with small groups leaving. Africa eventually connected every human alive today, because the travelers who stepped into the unknown were not just exploring new lands. They were carrying the future of our species with them. But the most incredible part of this journey is not only where humans went, it is the fact that their ancient footsteps still live inside us. Act 7. The journeys we never heard about. Today, we know the story of human expansion because some of those ancient journeys succeeded. But behind every successful migration were countless challenges, risks and stories that disappeared into the past. Leaving Africa was never a guaranteed path to survival. Some groups may have faced environments they could not overcome. Others may have reached new places but struggled to find the resources needed to continue. For every population that moved forward, there were likely journeys that ended before reaching the next horizon. The people who traveled into unknown lands carried more than tools and supplies. They carried uncertainty. They faced hunger, changing climates, unfamiliar landscapes, and the constant challenge of adapting to places their ancestors had never experienced. Yet their story was not defined by the difficulties they faced. It was defined by their ability to respond. Human history was not shaped by a species that never failed. It was shaped by a species that learned, adjusted, and continued moving forward. Every successful adaptation became knowledge for the next generation. Every challenge overcome became part of the foundation that allowed humans to spread farther across the planet. The journey of our ancestors was not a simple story of exploration. It was a story of risk, resilience, and survival. And the most remarkable evidence of that journey is not only found in ancient landscapes or archaeological discoveries. It is carried within every human being alive today. Act 8. The journey inside us. Thousands of years have passed since those first human journeys began. The landscapes have changed. The climates have shifted. The world our ancestors knew has been transformed beyond recognition. But their story never disappeared. The evidence of those ancient migrations can still be found in archaeological discoveries, in the history written across continents, and in the shared ancestry carried by humans around the planet. Those early travelers were not searching for a world they already understood. They were stepping into uncertainty. They faced unfamiliar environments, unexpected challenges, and dangers they could not predict. But they carried something that allowed them to continue: the ability to adapt, the ability to cooperate, the ability to look beyond the horizon and imagine a future they could not see. They were not kings or conquerors. They were ordinary humans making extraordinary choices. And because they continued forward, every person alive today is connected to that ancient journey. Thousands of years ago, their footsteps disappeared into the unknown. But those same footsteps continue through every human life on Earth. The story of human migration is not only about where our ancestors went. It is about who we became. One of the most transformative journeys in human history was not simply a movement across continents. It was the journey that shaped humanity itself.